Is it possible to raise this?
Yes, just pull it up. Hold on to the base and pull it up. There you go.
I don't want to be rude either. Is there a customary policy on how many to read?
No, there is not. Normally there might be a 5-minute time limit, but we don't have enough people to worry about that.
All right. Forgive me, I'm a little rusty.
Just don't read more than the feature and you're good.
Yes, don't spend an hour up there. I think we'll be fine.
Well, there's no way for me to judge that, but okay. So this poem was written in response to how other people like to engage in argumentative conversations. Everything is composed of shades of gray, or so at least some often like to say. That there's no such thing as universal moral laws, and that only the ignorant and closed-minded would fail to subscribe to a fundamental collective of comforting conceptual flaws, often formed by pretentious pretenders preaching emotional fallacies, whom are followed by lemmings habitually leeching off of every word in order to fill their minds with intellectual fantasies. Shades of gray is the thought that any and every action, furthermore course of conduct, is intrinsically subjective due to intricacies in their respective circumstances. Therefore, nothing is inherently right or wrong, meaning that your reaction and interpretation of any given circumstance should be reflective of the collective choice predominant within the environment of said circumstances, which is typically comprised not from the wisest group, but rather the largest with the loudest voice. There is no black and white, and should you disagree, then you're either closed-minded or a fool incapable of comprehending the simple and inescapable conclusion that right and wrong are merely shades of gray, meaning my publicly formed opinion is at the very least and at the utmost as good as yours. Ergo, an open-minded and enlightened individual would not voice any personal conviction to the contrary, thereby implying an inherent restriction on any other's unquestionable right to be of a different mind. And if you are intelligent enough to understand my opinion, then you should share it as well. And if you still don't, then you're obviously intellectually blind, and I, for one, won't deign to listen to, let alone consider ridiculous notions from an individual with such obviously bigoted connotations such as yourself. I admit shades of gray is indeed an interesting philosophical concept, in itself worthy of recognition, discussion, and contemplation. However, almost every self-described open-minded individual I've yet encountered has parroted the words shades of gray, not as a controversial device designed to invoke deeper consideration of one's own perspective on a given subject, but rather to express an excuse for something. For example, when you reach the point in the argument, and so proclaim shades of gray. When you reach the point in a conversation where they haven't the ability to logically contest your side of the argument, and so proclaim shades of gray. Meaning the whole conversation ultimately was based on personal opinions and on that subject, and since any given topic is entirely subjective, it doesn't matter what their point was, since ultimately yours is irrelevant as well. Now then, if my perception of this convoluted self-righteous conception has left you feeling offended, then I apologize, but that's not what I had initially intended. And yet, if you are still offended, then I must remind you that it's all shades of gray, and so since the offense you took originally stems from a personal perspective of my actions, your personal feelings on what I've said are ultimately irrelevant. This one is my first attempt at writing about a personal experience of my own. My story. This poem is my story. I always have trouble choosing where to begin. But I suppose the best place would be back when I was in kindergarten.
Can you speak up a little bit? I'm having a hard time hearing.
Or you can use the mic if you so wish. Just flip the little switch on. It's on the side. There you go.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes.
Much, yeah.
I always have trouble choosing where to begin, but I suppose the best place would be back when I was in kindergarten. Now even then, on that first day, right from the very start, it wasn't hard to see that I was a child who was easily set apart. I quickly gained the class's attention, with my accent, glasses, and red hair, not to mention the fact I was almost 2 feet taller than the rest, sitting in my chair. Honestly though, right now, that's neither here nor there. It wasn't very long into that first school year that I would come to experience my first real encounter with fear. And even though it happened so long ago, the effect still plagued me, I must confess. Now the source of that fear was not the schoolyard bully, as you might guess, but rather my teacher, only the first of many who would offer offense. She came from behind one morning during coloring time in silence, when suddenly out of nowhere, and with great violence, came the attack. With both hands, she dug her long nails into my face, whipping my head back. She screamed at me for some mischief that had been wrought on the second floor by fourth graders who had apparently vandalized the bathroom door. She called me all sorts of vile things and harsh, hurtful cries, and all I could do right then was sit there and stare into those cruel, hateful eyes. The rest of the class sat shocked and quiet as I sat crying, confused and scared. Finally, she dragged and threw me in a corner to stand out of sight. Quote, "No one is so much as to even look in his direction," the teacher declared, and none did, for fear of likewise suffering her spite. For almost half the day I remained like this, until the lunch bell rang, and in my exile. Things went a bit better for me after the bell, well, at least for a little while. You see, I had previously paid for the treat of buttered popcorn and a Pepsi to have during recess. So after lunch, with mountain excitement and childish glee, I got my treat and lined up to head outside. Unfortunately, where I would soon come to be met with yet further distress. Outside, I had just opened my pop to take a sip, but before the can had even reached my lip, the teacher yelled at me to stop. She called me over and asked, "What do you think you're doing? You don't get to have these." She tore my soda and popcorn out of my hands, poured them on the ground, and stared at me, ignoring the sound of my futile sobs and pleas. She proceeded to scold me and say I wasn't allowed to have recess, and that unless I did what I was told and returned to the classroom to sit alone, I would be punished. All too clearly, I could recall the feeling of her nails in my face, as though she had been digging for bone. Naturally, I went inside, but rather than return to the classroom, I listened to what my parents had said, that if I ever had any trouble at school, I was to go to the principal's. So I ran to his office instead. The principal was apparently too busy to see me, probably too busy fucking with the other kindergarten teacher, and so I was left to seek salvation with the secretary. I tried to tell her of how I had been abused, yet due to my speech impairment and tears, the most she could do was stare at me dumbly and obviously confused. As I hopelessly tried to beseech her assistance, in came my teacher. The secretary, still perplexed, released me into her care upon her insistence, and once out of the secretary's sight, she grabbed me by the ear and dragged me down the hall, spitting venomous spite. When one student asked what I had done wrong, my teacher snapped that it wasn't any of their business. Crying in pain and feeling trapped, I said that once I got home, I would tell my parents. She stopped in the middle of the hall and grabbed me by the shoulders, inciting a painful groan. She said that I had to take the long bus ride home. Well, all she had to do was make a phone call. She glared at me and asked, "Who do you think they would believe? A kid like you or an adult like me?" I wanted to disagree, yet at the time I hadn't dared. When I got home, I was still shedding a tear or two. I tried to explain what had happened, and just as I had been dreading, they laughed, saying that I was just nervous, being at a new school, that they had received a call from my teacher. It seemed that they did believe her over me after all. It occurred just as she had foretold, and I realized then that I was alone, left to fend for my own. And that's a hard fact to face when you're only 6 years old. I think I'm good right there.